For those of you who don't know me, and there are many of you who don't know me, but I'm a physicist by training with a PhD in cultural heritage science, and I've been at the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge for about 5.5 years now. Before that, I was in Washington at the National Gallery of Art, and before then in Paris. So for the past 10 or 12 years, I worked in museums and with museums, focusing on the non-invasive analysis of works of art, and specifically of manuscripts in the last 6 years or so. So all the research I'll discuss today was carried out at the Fitzwilliam Museum in collaboration with people both at the museum and elsewhere. And so all of my examples except for one relate to manuscripts. I do have one painting in, thanks to Spike Buckler, who's sitting there in the back, who's the senior research scientist at the Hamilton Carr Institute in Cambridge, which is a department of the Fitzwilliam Museum. So I'm grateful to him for sharing his pictures and his research with us. I was going to start trying to explain why we want to use images, but Roald has already done that. And my main point was, well, yes, images are a great way to convey information. So even though XRF scanning can't be considered an imaging method per se, because it's a scanning method, we're not taking individual images, it does produce images. And they're a great way to convey information in a cross-disciplinary environment like ours is. They're also the only way, as far as I can tell, to really pick out some things that no matter how many individual spectra you take, you're never going to be able to deduce or assume for sure that that information relates to a certain area. So you get information about the entire object you're looking at, or about the entire portion of the object you're scanning, and that's great. From the practical point of view, and again I'm biased towards manuscripts, I guess, the images that we produce with XRF scanning can help us detect previous compositions, and that's true for paintings as well, can help us detect text or images that are now hidden from view for a reason or another. For example, because a manuscript page has been cut and pasted on board, so we don't have access to the reverse anymore. There's lots we can do. Now with the Fitzwilliam, unfortunately, we don't have an M6. Maybe one day. We do have an RTAX. We've also been lucky enough in the past few years to collaborate with 2 different research groups which have brought their homemade XRF scanners to the Fitzwilliam. The first group is led by Professor Koen Janssens at the University of Antwerp, and I think they collaborated with you guys on the first XRF scanner. There was some research done together. So they visited us and the Hamilton Carr Institute twice now, and they've scanned a number of paintings as well as manuscripts. And then there's a second research group led by Francesco Paolo Romano from the Landis Laboratory in Catania, and they've also brought their scanner to the UK last year and scanned a large painting, which is the one I will be discussing, at Norwich Castle Museum, and then several manuscripts at the Fitzwilliam Museum. So all the data I will show today were obtained in collaboration with either of these 2 groups. So my very first example, I won't discuss any technical details of the equipment, so I'll just show some examples and try to see why, what benefits, I guess, we've gained from the use of macro-XRF scanning on some of the objects we've analyzed. In this specific case, it's just a small fragment, and I'm using it as an example to illustrate the importance of knowing what to look for and what to look at when you're looking through your data. So for example, in this case, I've put up 2 maps, one for tin and one for lead. Historically speaking, there are a total of 4 pigments in which I can find these 2 elements. So mosaic gold, which is tin sulfide, red lead, which is lead tetroxide, lead white, lead carbonate, and lead tin yellow. These are the 4 pigments I'm sort of looking for when I'm looking at these 2 maps. Now for ease of analysis, I've combined the 2 maps. It's not an RGB, it's a GB composite, I guess, just 2 channels. It really helps to look at them this way because I can hypothesize the presence of mosaic gold in the bright green areas where tin is present without lead. So I've got tin, I don't have lead, that's probably mosaic gold. The whitish highlights on the row, whitish in the map, are the areas where both tin and lead are present. So I can hypothesize the presence of lead tin yellow. And then all the other areas, which are just blue, are going to be either lead white or red lead. And of course, I'm short of looking at the image in knowing that an orange area is probably a red lead, although it could contain lead white as well. I don't have a way of telling, basically. If there could be both red lead and lead white in some areas, and of course just the lead map is not going to is not going to tell me that. What actually helps to pick up the different pigments is also the fact that I chose the tin K and lead L lines, because I could also choose the tin L and the lead M lines, and that image isn't as good. And Rolda's mentioned this already, that the possibility to choose between different lines for the same element. These are the low energy lines, and the image is more noisy for a number of reasons. First of all, there's a lot more overlap between lines related to different elements in the low energy area. So for example, if you look here, these green areas, which correspond to the pink leaves, they don't actually contain tin, they contain calcium, which I found in the red lake. But that low energy, I'm not able to distinguish between the tin and the calcium line. I've also pretty much lost the tin line here. The signal's too low, the energy is so low that with just a little tin there, the signal doesn't get to the detector, so I've completely lost the highlight here. If I just looked at this, I wouldn't say that that's Latin yellow, basically. I could miss that pigment entirely. But having two maps from two different lines for the same element can be really useful. And this is an example with mercury. If I compare the low energy lines, that's the image in the center, with the high energy mercury lines on the left, I can see that there are some features, these lines, for example, that don't appear here at all. And that's a way to say that these are on the reverse of the object, because the high energy lines penetrate the parchment and the paint layers on the front and reach the detector. The low energy lines for mercury can't do that. They just don't reach the detector from the back. And in this case, I can actually just turn the piece around and look at it. So this is trivial. But again, there are many cases where the reverse of an object is not accessible to us. So being able to compare these two is a really good way to say something is on the surface, on the front of the object, or rather on the back and inaccessible. The next example, which I want to discuss a bit more in detail, and which we've actually published last year, concerns a manuscript fragment which has puzzled our scholars at the museum for quite some time, because they haven't been able to attribute it not only to an artist, but not even to a school, not even to a specific city. They even wonder if it might be a fake at some point, because they just couldn't place it. Stylistically, it's closest to the manuscripts produced in Rome and Bologna around 1500, but it's quite unique. It's beautiful, but it doesn't look like anything anybody had seen before. We were asked to analyze it just to learn more about it in general, and sort of with the secret hope that we could maybe help. First of all, make sure it wasn't a fake, and maybe help put it in context a little bit more. So we did a bit of site-specific analysis, and then we did a Macro-XRF scan. It was really interesting because, for example, it helped us understand better the copper green pigment that we were looking at. So what you see here is copper in blue and zinc in green, and the cyan areas are the areas where the two, copper and zinc, coexist. And what is interesting to see is that zinc is only present in copper green areas, not in copper blue areas. So that tells us two things. First, that the green wasn't obtained by mixing azurite, a copper blue, with a yellow pigment, because otherwise we'd see the impurity in both. And mixing blue and yellow is something that Italian illuminators did quite a bit at that time. So this is a good piece of information. It's definitely a different copper pigment. The fact that there is zinc in the copper green could tell us a couple of things. Could be indicative of the presence of rosacite, which is a copper zinc carbonate. It's a mineral that is often found with malachite in copper deposits. It could also, if it's an artificial synthetic green pigment, it could mean that brass was used as the raw material. So we still have two possibilities. We still can't know exactly what type of copper green we're looking at. Thankfully, although noisy, we did obtain maps for arsenic and antimony, which are both also common impurities in malachite, and they map to the copper green area. The co-presence, I guess, of copper, zinc, antimony, and arsenic in the green areas is a really good indication that it is a malachite type pigment, it's a mineral. Copper green. Another thing that the elemental maps told us, which we hadn't noticed before, was about the different use of blues. So we had noticed that lapis lazuli was used in the miniature, and you see that the red areas Red is the potassium map, so we're using that to map lapis because the silicon and aluminum maps are just too noisy and not reliable enough. So we could see that the blue in the miniature was lapis, and then the blue used for the leaves in the initial and in the border was azurite. What we hadn't realized, or what I hadn't realized, was that the dark blue used to outline all the decoration and the leaves is actually lapis. Those are the magenta areas in the map, so areas where we see both copper and potassium, because you've got lapis on top of azurite, so you're seeing both elements. So this was really nice, because it's small areas, we wouldn't necessarily go and analyze them specifically. You'd have to be doing XRF at really low energy in order to pick up the lapis on top of the copper. So unless you're looking for it, you don't find it, basically, unless you've got a map. So this was really, it was a really nice result, actually, that we got from the maps. And lastly, for me, the most interesting result about this object was the fact that we were able to prove the use of manganese oxide, manganese black, as a pigment. Now, the problem with manganese is that, as you probably know, there's always traces of, or often traces of manganese in earth pigments. So we'd seen manganese in the individual spectra in brown and grey areas, but we just got so it's an earth, a number, or an earth with a bit of manganese. But then when we looked at the maps for manganese and iron, we realized they didn't match at all. So manganese is not present in areas where the iron is, so it's definitely not an impurity in the iron pigments, in the earth pigments. It's used as a pigment in right, it's manganese black. It's interesting from a scientific point of view, I think. It's a really good use of the method. But it's also interesting, actually, from the point of view of the context of this object, which is what we were really trying to nail down. Because research carried out in the last 15 years or so, mostly here at the National Gallery, but then with the input of colleagues at the V&A and the Getty in terms of the illuminations, not the panel paintings, has shown that around 1500, the beginning of the 16th century, there was a group of mostly Italian painters and a few French ones, which used some unusual black pigments, including manganese black, manganese oxide. Now, first we know the identification of manganese black in this miniature is the first time it's been found in a miniature for sure. The interesting thing is that although it doesn't help us say this miniature was painted definitely in Rome or in Bologna, it does absolutely support that as first of all, the dating, because these pigments were used for a relatively short period of time, and also the artistic milieu, because the pigments were used by artists working in central and northern Italy at that time. So it strongly supports the fact that this miniature was produced in that specific context, which, again, it's not a definitive result, but my art historian colleagues were really happy to hear that. Because again, because of the lack of context for this fragment. This miniature had one last surprise in store for us. We could tell from XRF, the XRF map, that an arsenic sulfide pigment had been used for a lot of the sort of ochre yellow areas, and that's, to be honest, that's as far as XRF could take us. We couldn't tell what kind of arsenic sulfide pigment it was. But we were lucky enough to have Team Pigment from the University of Durham with their portable Raman spectrometer. They came over, did some analysis for us, and we identified what some people call artificial orpiment. It's an arsenic sulfide glass, which has only been recently identified securely on painted objects. We've identified it on this fragment and on another manuscript painted at just about the same time by an Italian artist in France. These are the only two manuscripts I've ever seen it on. And we're hoping that by analyzing more manuscripts, this might again become a way to help us with context, because it is a relatively unusual pigment, and it's possible that its use might also be sort of localized geographically and chronologically, like the unusual blacks. But I'm hoping, in the next few years, we find arsenic sulfide glass. Please let us know, because it'd be really, really good to be able to say more about this sort of unusual pigment. Now, my next example is again on a manuscript, but it adds another dimension to the chemical maps, because when Stein from the University of Antwerp last visited us, he also brought his alpha, the Bruker portable FTIR spectrometer, which he had mounted on a carriage to use it as a scanner. The great thing was that we could scan the same object and have both chemical element maps and functional group maps and combine those together, and that really helped specify the nature of some of the pigments that we were identifying. So we looked at this small fragment, which is about 17 by 17 centimeters. We got beautiful elemental maps, which really helped us understand the pigments and the painting techniques used. One of the things we looked at in particular was the gilding technique. And you can see in the gold map, you can clearly see the gold leaves, and you can also see the places where the two adjacent leaves overlap. Those are the brighter areas in the map. There's a double thickness of gold, and so you get a much stronger signal. You can actually measure the pieces of leaf, which can be interesting. And then we found there was calcium and there was iron in areas of gilding. So it's the kind of ground layer for gold that you expect. The iron is probably due to the presence of a red clay type material. And the calcium, when we get this far, the only thing we know is a calcium containing material. We can suppose it's gypsum because that's what historically has been used. But we can't be absolutely sure. There's some little losses in the gilding, but they were too small for us to analyze by reflected spectroscopy, which would tell us if gypsum were present. They were just too small, we couldn't access them. So this is just a composite map. The blue areas, the bright blue areas, are the areas of loss. So the areas where there is no gold or not enough gold, then calcium really shines through. If you then do an FTIR scan and you map the sulfite stretching band, you can see that it maps to two leaves, which are pink. So again, that's the gypsum in the red lake, but also to lots of little dots, which match the areas of loss in the leaf. So that's the only place where the calcium signal is coming through, because we wouldn't be able to measure it through the gold leaf, obviously. But wherever there's a small loss or just a thin layer remaining, we do see the sulfate stretch. So we can say it's calcium sulfate. I'm not going to say gypsum because we think it might not be gypsum, but it's definitely calcium sulfate. Something else that the combination with the FTIR mapping can help us do is distinguish between the different lead pigments, something that in the first example we hadn't been able to do, the red lead and lead white problem. So in this combination map, which is again tin and lead, the blue areas are tin alone, so that's the tin sulfite. The yellow areas are tin and lead, so that's a lead tin yellow. And then in red, you've got everything that's just lead, so those will be both lead white and red lead. And once you add the FTIR maps and you look at the lead oxide stretching and then the carbonate bending, and you map those, you can separate the red lead, the lead hydroxide, from the lead white, which is lead carbonate. And you can look for areas where both are present, which might be areas where red lead and lead white are mixed together, which we wouldn't be able, just based on color, we wouldn't be able to say. One last example regarding manuscripts. We decided to scan this fragment, one of these actually, the one on the left. They're Spanish, they come from a royal monastery. So they're quite important, but again, we've lost most of their context. And the manuscripts came into the manuscripts conservation studio at the Fitzwilliam Museum because they've both been pasted on board or a thick card, which has been partially removed from behind one of them. The question for conservators was, can we remove it? Can we completely remove it, or should we just leave it alone? And if you look at these closely, both of the objects are actually collages. So the central miniatures are one image, but then each border is made up of 8 or 10 different pieces. You can see some of it here and here. So the question for me was how much retouching had gone on in order to make these different border pieces sort of match and look pretty. Because, this looks like it's, one design, even though the rest of the design doesn't necessarily match. So how much retouching had gone on, basically, in order to make the collages. And this is how much retouching has gone on, which is, I'm afraid, quite a bit. And also not just in the borders. We were quite surprised, because we were really looking for it at the edges between the main miniature and the various pieces of border. But actually, basically all of these white scrolls have been completely repainted with zinc white. The top half of this little chap here is quite modern. There's a lot, especially along the borders, but again, quite a bit even in the center. And also, the fact that they've been collaged so much means they are not removing the backing, actually, because it would just probably fall apart completely. So by putting together the different maps, we identified a number of pigments. By sort of comparing the ones we identified with those we didn't identify, which are pigments introduced in the second half of the 19th century, we're guessing that the intervention dates about the 1840s, just before the fragments were acquired by Reverend Dewick, which was the first owner we know of. So we know they were made in Avila, and then we lose track of them, and we just know that Reverend Dewick acquired them at some point in the mid-19th century, and the museum purchased them from his son. So we are assuming now that the collages were made and retouched up in order for the fragments to go into the market, basically, in order to make them nice and pretty and something you can put on your wall. Before Reverend Dewick acquired it, wasn't him. Now my last example, which is the painting I promised to talk about. It's the so-called Past and Treasure. It's a large oil painting on canvas. It's also a rare record of a cabinet of treasures in British collecting. It was commissioned by Sir Robert Paston in the second half of the 17th century, probably painted by a Dutch artist. And it depicts some of the Paston family's treasures collected during travels, not just in Europe, but as far as Cairo and Jerusalem. And the Paston treasure was acquired by Norwich Museum Castle in 1947, where it's currently on display, where it was analysed at Norwich Castle Museum last April with the Macro-XRF scanner developed in Catania. The painting will be the subject of an exhibition next year. And Norwich Castle Museum, in partnership with the Yale Centre for British Art in the US, are trying to reunite as many of the objects depicted as they can together with the painting for the first time in 350 years. And Spike has been researching the painting for the exhibition. Now, before we look at the elemental maps, this is the X-radiograph of the painting. They did infrared imaging as well before they conserved the painting recently, but it just didn't do much for this painting. So I'm not showing you that image. But the X-radiograph is interesting because it shows a number of things, including 2 subsequent changes to this area on the right-hand side. So if we look closer, that's what you see on the left is what the painting looks like now. And here on the right, you see a large oval shape, which is likely to have been a sort of large platter dish. And in the same area, you can distinguish the figure of a woman. And this woman was clearly in the original version of the picture and painted up later. She's most likely to be the wife of Robert Paston, who commissioned the painting, and the mother of Mary, who's the little girl depicted at the center of the painting. This is the map for cobalt, which suggests the use of smalt as a blue pigment, which is not the only blue pigment used, because it doesn't account, in the map, it doesn't account for all the blue areas present, but it does appear to see along the edge of the platter. So we can hypothesize that that was a blue and white Chinese porcelain type dish, just like there's another little one behind the little girl's head of these blue and white porcelain dishes. So we can suggest that that was what that platter might have looked like as well. I should say that in terms of blue, ultramarine blue was found in a lot of areas in the painting by other methods, but it doesn't show up in decay map. Potassium map is dominated by areas of smalt and areas of lakes, where there's more potassium, and so those absolutely dominate the map. I'm guessing possibly doing a bit more extraction, working on the map a little bit more, we might be able to pick up the ultramarine, but if you just look at the map, there just isn't enough potassium in the ultramarine to be able to map it as a pigment. And again, the silicon and aluminium maps are just too noisy to be of any use. Now, if we go back to the overpainted area, and we combine the maps for mercury, copper, and cobalt, you can start to see that the woman probably had a red corset. She's got bright red lips. She's got blue ribbons or feathers in her hair, possibly, and a green or blue copper-based sort of sash. So we can start to think about how she might have been dressed, what she might have looked like. If we look at red and yellow pigments, so arsenic and iron, it's interesting to note that a lot of the golden objects in the image were painted using arsenic sulfide pigments, but some of them weren't, and earths were used instead. And it's something that if you just look at the painting is not immediately apparent. And again, the map really helps in that case. There's also sort of a concentration of the arsenic sulfide pigment towards the center of the painting, while the earths are used more in the periphery. But I'm going to let Spike elaborate on that later, if he wants to. The mercury map is interesting because it proves that lots of areas which currently appear very pale, almost bleached out, must have been bright red, and the lobster is a case in point. She's not as red as she's supposed to be, really. So there must have been some kind of probably degradation process going on. And again, this is something one could investigate more, because all that mercury suggests that she would have been a lot redder, and that makes sense visually as well. And finally, the calcium map, amongst other things, shows the conservation treatment that went on, all the infills that were added to the painting. And now my final slide, this is the copper map. We of course find copper in green pigments. The copper was also used in low amounts as a secative in oil paint. Now, despite the low amount in which you usually find it as a secative, you can see it really clearly in the smoke coming up from the extinguished candle. So the smoke was probably treated with carbon black, to which verdigris dissolved in oil was added as a secative. Although it's hardly visible with the naked eye on the actual painting, this thin column of smoke is clearly identifiable in the elemental map. And actually, this is important because together with the hourglass and the clock, the snapped out candle represents the passing of time, which is one of the central themes of the painting. Themes which I won't be discussing now, but if you're interested, you can definitely find more about them in the exhibition next year. And I think I'm going to stop here.